Okay, this is the second section for my class today. So if you have not yet watched the previous clip, make sure that you watch both expectancy violation as well as cognitive dissonance for today's class. Um, there you have it. So expectancy violation theory. Start off a little bit with discussions on the art of war. This is a book you probably heard of. It's written by Sun Tzu in 6th, 5th century BC. And it's a lot about military strategies. It's also used a lot in sort of like by politicians, business leaders, etc. throughout the centuries. The major theme of this entire book is to be prepared, right? So we talk about like expectancy violations. Expectancy violations is I have expectations for how things are going to unfold, and when people violate those, they screw up my plans, right? We all walk around the world trying to predict the behavior. Well, we walk around the world thinking that other people's behavior is somehow going to be predictable, right? So you walk by your neighbor, you say hello, you expect them to say hello back. All right, you go up to meet someone, you shake their hand, you hold out your hand for them to shake it, you expect them to reciprocate that, right? There's certain distances that we expect in sort of public settings, right? If we're on an empty bus, we don't expect someone to get on the bus and sit next to us, right? So the art of war is really about, being prepared. Try to predict your enemy's maneuvers, right? Know who your enemy is. So some of the major themes with regard to being prepared: know your enemy. It's like, why? It's because, well, you want to be able to predict their behavior. You want to know what their arguments are. This also goes into some of my stuff on issues of like, free speech and academic inquiry we've talked about in some classes. I am always flabbergasted when I meet other academics who talk about how they don't read the articles or the books of people they strongly disagree with, right? And there's plenty of famous public intellectuals out there, and you might drop their name and when someone says like I've never read their book before, I would never read their books, right? But they have all this like nasty stuff to say about them. I don't like that person. That person stinks. They're a horrible individual. I would never read their book. And one, it's like, how do you know they're horrible if you've never read their book? But two, if you want to make a strong argument against them, like you need to know what it is they said, right? Um, so make sure that you are preparing by studying, your enemy. You need to know yourself, right? How are you going to prepare? So this gets into a lot of things with like Stoic practices. So if you're familiar with the Stoics, which I've talked about in some other clips, Stoicism is a lot about sort of being prepared and putting yourself through difficult situations while the sun is shining and things are not dangerous, so that when you do get into sort of dangerous or precarious positions, you've already practiced it. So Stoics, like when things were really good and they had a lot of food, for instance, Stoics would practice like fasting for several days at a time because they knew they were sort of doing it in a safe environment. If I really needed bread, I could go back home and get bread. Because when a famine comes, a Stoic wants to know, like, oh, I've practiced being hungry before. I know what this is like. I'm not going to freak out. Stoics would practice sleeping outside, right, in like muddy, rainy, gross conditions, even though they had a nice soft bed back home, because if things ever went wrong and they had to sleep in the mud for a while, they had no other choice. They wanted to be prepared for it. All right. Okay. And know your environment, right? You can only adapt if you've prepared for all circumstances. So, expectancy violation concerned primarily with the structure of nonverbal messages. It asserts that when communication norms are violated, the violation may be perceived either favorably or unfavorably, depending on the perception the receiver has of the violator. So, usually when we think about expectancy violation, we think about someone does something and it's off-putting to me, right? It's surprising to me. However, notice here, it can also be favorable, right? So imagine you ask a girl out on the first date, you have a big crush on her, and let's say she agrees to the date, and then at the end of the night, it's only the first date, so it's like first date, drop her off at home, be gentleman, right? Kind of walk away. But let's say she leans in and she kisses you after the first date. You're like, that is an expectancy violation, right? I did not expect, right? So this girl I have a crush on is going to kiss me on the first date. Woohoo, right? You are going to view that as favorable. So there are ways in which people violate our expectations with regard to proper behavior that could be favorable, even though we usually think of these things as unfavorable, such as, Kanye West jumping on stage when Taylor Swift is accepting an award, right? It's like someone's accepting an award, it's like stay off the stage, that's their stage time, all right? Proxemics is a study of space. this is going to vary culture to culture, and it's going to vary based on like sort of like geographical density, population density within a geographical area. Um, so, is hugging in the workplace classroom okay? Why or why not? We sort of know that these things aren't okay. Um, I do know, and this is something I tell a lot of people, like hugging at like office Christmas parties and stuff is always like this weird thing that I've always been kind of not weirded out about, but just I'm always like, I don't know why this is a thing that has to happen. I might give someone like a side hug if they're like really into, hugging at work during like a party. But yeah, it's just like a weird thing that goes on sometimes. Um, so you have these moments where you're like, yeah, like hugging in the workplace in the classroom's not okay. Maybe at the end of the semester, a student comes up and wants to shake your hand, right? Thank you for a good semester. That might be, appropriate, but we sort of realize that there's these sort of spatial issues with regard to what is and isn't appropriate. So the study of space, these are general rules for most American culture, right? Intimate space is 0 to 18 inches with loved ones, family members, romantic partners. Personal space is like 18 to 4 feet. So this is something like if a student comes in my office, it's a one-on-one conversation, but we're not friends, right? So it's like you should have 4 feet between strangers if those are, yeah, non-close individuals, if you're having a one-on-one conversation. Um, a social space, so if you're in a small group setting or some sort of like small party gathering, 4 to 12 feet between individuals. In a public space, you're probably gonna have 12 feet between people. So if you're at a park, right? If you're at an open park, yeah, and someone gets within like 5 feet of you, you're like, why are you so close to me? Like, there's a lot of room here. Let's all spread out. All right. What should you do? Now, this is a fun little question. This is like real world stuff. What should you do the moment someone violates your space? You should tell them that they're violating your space. So in a very the best sort of like creepy way to describe it, which is very, very true. And I've had plenty of mostly women in my life tell me these types of stories, and the first thing I tell them is like, tell that guy right away, like you're in my space. So what you'll notice if a guy's like at a bar, trying to hit on a young woman, he might buy her. He's gonna sit next to her, right? And slowly throughout the course of the interaction, he's trying to sort of like push the limits of essentially violating her space, right? Just to see what he can get away with, right? So first he might like reach over and touch her hand. If she's okay with that, he's gonna sit there for a while, 5-10 minutes, and then he's gonna try to touch her elbow, try to touch her upper arm, and he's gonna move to her back, right? He's gonna try to put his arm around her, right? He doesn't go immediately from 0 to arm around her, but he's just sort of like slowly seeing how far he can move his hand up her arm and around her shoulder to put his arm around her, to see how much he can get away with, right? And this is something that actually happens, right? So the moment someone violates your space, you should tell them like, don't touch me, I don't appreciate that. That's going to shut down the conversation. I had an incident a few years back where I was in a very I was out of the country. I was in a very busy city out of the country, and there's a lot of sort of scammers on the street, trying to like run their little games and stuff to get money out of tourists. And this guy was following me, and I said, no thank you, no thank you. And he finally comes up and he puts his arm around me to act like we're friends. And immediately, as soon as he touched my arm, I turned around and I went off on him, right? But that let him know, like, no, you're not gonna touch me. You're not gonna put your arm around me. You're not gonna like comfort me to come back to your little, your little game area where you're gonna try to scam, $20 out of me or whatever. So as soon as someone violates your space, you have to tell them immediately. So if you're at a bar, especially for young women, if you're at a bar and you're talking to a guy and it's nice and friendly, right? But you're uncertain. If he puts his hand, if he tries to grab your hand and you're not ready for that, you have to say like, hey, and I'm enjoying the conversation, but we're not there yet, so let's just keep this friendly. Otherwise, people continue to test limits. Territorial, your perceived ownership of areas. So you have primary, secondary, and public territories. So primary is your exclusive space. This would be something like a bedroom, right? Your car, right? If you walk into your bedroom or you go to your car and you see that there are other people's items in that space, you are going to think, this is a violation of my primary territory, right? And you're allowed to get upset and you're allowed to sort of voice your how upset you are. Secondary territories are a little bit different because they're affiliated spaces. So if we were in the classroom, a really fun way to think about this is when you walk into a classroom, let's say like week like 3 or 4, by week 3 or 4, you and everybody else is sitting in the exact same seat. There are no assigned seats in college, but by week 3 or 4, everyone walks in the classroom and they start sitting in the same seat. And this is crazy social phenomenon that it's always fun to watch as a professor, is because you know where everyone's going to sit. Secondary territories is you walk into class one day and you see, or a month into class, and someone is sitting in the seat that you always sit in, and you're like, that's my seat. There's no names on the seat. You all can walk into the classroom, sit in any chair you want, right? But a month in, you walk into the classroom, you see someone is sitting in your seat. Now, you can't really call them out on it, right? They're not in your bedroom. You can't say, get out of here, what are you doing? But they're in a seat that's affiliated with you. So you do have this sort of disgust emotional reaction to it, like, oh, who's this person think they are sitting in my seat, right? So that reaction lets you know that it's a secondary affiliated space, but you're not allowed to actually call them out on it because it's not a primary space. All right. So affiliated spaces are spaces that people affiliate, or excuse me, secondary spaces. People affiliate those spaces with you. You affiliate those spaces with who you are at a certain time, right? Because if you're in my 10 o'clock class, right, if someone's sitting in your seat at noon, it's like you have no affiliation to it because the time matters, right? Because by noon, a different class is in that classroom. So that's what affiliate space is. And then finally, public territories like open spaces, etc. Right? You can't really get mad at somebody being at a public park. All right, expectancies drive human interactions. You know how to act and perceive based on others' behaviors. Experiences are learned, right, through culture, family, religious differences. So again, how close you are to someone is going to vary based on your culture. It's also going to be based on your geographic location, right? So if you're in a more rural area, things are going to be spread out. If you're in New York City subways at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's like, yeah, things are going to be crowded, all right? And people are going to be all up in your space, but it's sort of culturally understood, like it's perfectly acceptable. That 4 or 5 people are going to be touching you, like shoulder to shoulder on the subway. All right. People make predictions based on nonverbal behaviors. So this is the big thing, right? We need people to act in predictable ways. Expectancy violation is about when people act in ways that I did not predict. And again, sometimes it can be favorable, like getting a kiss at the end of a first date, right? And sometimes it can be unfavorable, all right? So we walk through the world with cultural norms. We predict that people are going to act in accordance to those cultural norms, and when they don't, it throws us off. Some more information here with regard to where it comes from. Individual factors, our age, personality, and our gender. So we interact with people. So men interact with men differently than women interact with women. Women and men interact differently as far as predictable behaviors. So these individual factors come into play. With regard to age, right? We might be more close and kind and affectionate with young kids. Like if a young kid wants a hug, it's like, all right, I'll give a kid a hug. Or like an older person wants a hug, it's like, yeah, give an older person a hug. All right. If some guy I work with wants a hug in the middle of the day, it's like, probably not going to give you a hug. All right. So the age, right, the gender of the person, their personality, etc. There are people who I might have a working relationship with, but their personality is one of sort of is very bubbly and affectionate and kind and compassionate. And even if I'm not a expressive person, it's like I know that person is very expressive and they're expressive with everyone. So yeah, their personality might make it so I feel more likely to violate my own norms for nonverbal communication. So hugging, handshakes, whatever. All right. Relationship factors, do you and that person have a prior history? And context factors, family events, social events, environments, right? So one of these things would be like, it's okay to high five or even hug a stranger at a stadium when your team scores, right? So if you're sitting next to a guy and they have on the same team jersey as you do and your team scores, it's like, I don't know you, you're a stranger, and you're giving hugs and high fives. Like, it's not okay to go up into McDonald's and hug a stranger, right? Even if they're wearing the same jersey as you are. All right. So this environmental social function context is going to matter with regard to, again, predicting behavior. When are things okay and when are things not okay? How do we know what we know? right? There's pre-interactional expectations. So what do people bring to the interaction? And then interaction expectations are the ability to follow scripts as they unfold. So can you take a hint, right? If you go into like shake someone's hand or hug them or touch their hand, right? If you're on a date or something, and they kind of pull away, like, can you take a hint and say like, okay, like, we're not at the stage yet where this person wants to be touched, for instance. This is just a picture I like to show people. So this is George W. Bush, and he is holding hands here, right? So two foreign leaders. This is I believe, Prince of Saudi Arabia, might be the king, but they're holding hands, all right? And this is very common in other countries for two men who aren't in a romantic relationship, they're just friendly, holding hands and walking with one another. It's not, it is normal in certain places around the world. So you sit there and you say, okay, how is this script unfolding? What are the cultural norms with regard to two men who are doing diplomacy together, showing some sort of friendship towards one another, walking around holding hands, all right? So it's not abnormal. And then finally, arousal and threat. So this has to do with a change in mental physical states based on violated expectations. So cognitively, I'm mentally aware that something's happened, right? Like you're being aroused, like I know something's happening. And physically, your body changes, right? So you get a little rush of adrenaline, you might turn flush, okay? The threat threshold is the tolerance of the violation, right? So how much can you take before you sort of say that's my boundary? So you go back to that dating scene where if somebody, some guy's hitting on a young woman in a bar, she might be okay. She might not be okay with any sort of touching at first, but the threat threshold is like, well, I'm okay with him putting his hand on my hand. I wasn't predicting it. It's a little bit weird, but I'm not gonna say it. And I might be okay with the arm. As soon as he touches my shoulder, okay, that's as much threat threshold as I can take, right? So here's a little game you all played with your siblings growing up, the I'm not touching you game. It's like, you might be able to get this close to my face, but as soon as you get this close to my face, like now I'm gonna start yelling and mom's gonna have to pull over the car. All right, so threat threshold is a person is slowly closing in on my personal space. How far do they have to go before I'm actually gonna call them out? And again, if you're in like my advice to you, whether you're out on a date or you are, in a big crowd in a big city with strangers trying to get your attention, as soon as they cross some sort of physical boundary with you, with regard to you feel you don't want them in your space, like call them out immediately, right? Because the longer it goes, the more likely they feel like they can take advantage of a situation. But most people don't sort of call it out immediately. Somebody, for instance, on a date, someone might say, well, he's touching my hand. Maybe it's just me being paranoid and, he doesn't, that's not creepy. It's just sort of like, casual. He's trying to sort of get to know me kind of thing. But you have to make sure that you articulate your very clear boundaries with individuals. And say like, look, like I think you're a fine individual, and I'm sure you didn't mean anything by it, but like right now I'm just not okay with us touching and holding hands on the first date or whatever it might be. All right, so there you have it. That's expectancy violation, and we'll get to some more stuff next time. Make sure you watch the discussion on cognitive dissonance today as well.